One of the keys to Magic's success was Richard Garfield's obsession with solving one particular problem. The problem was that if you allowed players to customize the game pieces that they played the game with, what's stopping them from choosing only the best ones? He called this the queen problem after he thought about if in chess you could customize the pieces on the board, what would stop a player from choosing all queens? Previously, we discussed how the mana and lands system of Magic the Gathering is part of how Richard designed the game to address the queen problem, but there's quite a few other ways that Richard attempted to solve these problems when he was designing Magic the Gathering. So let's take a look at those other solutions, see what we can learn for our own games, and figure out why one of them was so bad that it had to be banned from the game in the very first set.
Distraction makers.
So first, let's talk about why this is such an important problem to solve. The way that I define a game is that they are rules that create meaningful decisions with uncertain outcomes and measurable results, and you loop through that process multiple times until you arrive at sort of the conclusion of the game. And if any of these pieces aren't intact, the game will be kind of lacking in some way. I think uncertainty is like really the key here, because if you remove uncertainty from this sort of recipe, your choices are no longer meaningful, right? Because if you know the outcome, there's no reason to pick any other choice than the one that leads you to the best outcome. And this is really, I think, at the core of the queen problem. And the thing to keep in mind is that players are constantly working to solve your game, right? They are looking for what are the best pieces, what are the best strategies, how do I execute them as efficiently and effectively every time. In order to maintain that uncertainty, you have to find solutions to the queen problem. You have to kind of, you create what I call systems of entropy, which are ways for the game to present obstacles to players and create friction so that players have a hard time just playing the best stuff all of the time. One way to solve this problem is to close your game off, right? You basically choose to say, these are the pieces, and I, as the game designer, have selected those for you so that they are not all the most powerful pieces, and therefore you must navigate through the game using a lot of different pieces that have different strategic components and different advantages and disadvantages to them. And this would be something like chess, right? Where you have pawns, you have queens, bishops, rooks, and they all move in different ways. They have different strengths and weaknesses, but as a player, you must navigate the game with those pieces ultimately to win the game. So just for a moment, so we can kind of illustrate how a game systems can kind of break down if we remove these systems of entropy, let's take a look at Tetris real quick. I assume everybody knows how Tetris works at this point, but just to be brief, Tetris is a block stacking game, effectively, where you are given random pieces. There's technically 5 unique tetraminos in Tetris, which are shapes made of 4 connected blocks that are connected orthogonally. The challenge really is that it gives you these pieces randomly, and you must figure out how they align together to get them to stack correctly. And you're accumulating points, and the game continues to kind of speed up as you're matching those bricks. And the game will continue until you lose, right? There's the end of the game is, did you mess up stacking these blocks enough that it reaches the top of the screen, and then you lose. The systems of entropy that are in Tetris are that there are different types of bricks. You don't get to choose which one you're given. They are given to you randomly. There's a pace pressure that is a system of entropy, which means that you don't have infinite time to manipulate the tetramino into the exact correct position that you would want to put it in. You don't have infinite time to think about it. There's a pressure as it moves down the screen and eventually will land and solidify itself in that position. And so as a thought experiment, we could say, well, what happens to Tetris if we remove these systems of entropy? You could just choose whichever one you wanted, and you had infinite time to place it. Everyone would just choose the vertical bar, and you would just fill the screen up with the vertical bar, and that would not be much of a game, right? We have now removed the uncertainty. We've removed any challenge. That's a solved game, right? All you're doing is just choosing the vertical bar, putting it in the position all the way across the screen, and just getting Tetris infinitely. Wrapping your head around these systems of entropy in Tetris, this also gives designers knobs to adjust to change the difficulty of Tetris, right? You can change the type of randomness in which the pieces are distributed so that players are sort of more likely to get pieces that they might need at any given moment. You can adjust how quickly the pace of the pieces fall. And also something that was added in sort of later versions of the game is your ability to hold a piece. And another knob they have is how many preview pieces that you get, right? In the original NES Tetris, which is the one that the tournaments are played in, there's no way to hold a piece. The pieces are given to you entirely randomly, and you're only allowed one preview to see just basically the next piece that will be coming after you place the current piece that you're manipulating. But in other versions of Tetris, you can have up to 5 previews, and this changes the difficulty of the game, but also changes your these sort of systems of entropy and how likely it is that you get sort of the queen. So we'll move on from Tetris, but hopefully that illustrates the ideas of how the queen problem exists in a different game other than Magic, and how that game created systems to solve those problems. Let's get into Magic now. Magic has various ways that it's attempted to solve this problem. Within the game systems themselves, we have lands and mana, which we've already kind of talked about in a previous video. But basically, you have a mana cost of a card, you have mana in your deck, so it's in tension with the other cards that you need to play to win the game. Cards are also split amongst the color pie, so only certain effects are accessible within different colors. So if you want to branch out to have the most possible effect you might need, you would need to combine colors together, which makes your deck less consistent. There's kind of a tension between you playing all of the queens from every color, right? And the cost of the cards gives you an amount of granularity, right? Like you can pay for different, the cost of cards is variable between how many colored pips that a card needs to be played and how many generic mana is used to play those cards. The mana system itself, it starts to fail over time if the color pie starts to break down, like too many effects end up in too many other colors, it's too easy to have access to them, or that getting access to the colors themselves becomes trivial. So if you're printing a lot of lands and cards that have mana fixing associated with them, things like dual lands, if those things are too easily available, then you're sort of you're breaking down the penalty for playing too many colors. And Commander itself actually has another system here, which is color identity, which means the commander, the sort of leader card of your deck, dictates what colors your deck is allowed to play. But this is a very hard limitation, similar to saying you can only play 4 copies of a card in your deck. And so there's not a lot of granularity there. There's not that risk reward of, I'm going to make my deck less consistent so that I can get access to more colors. And part of that is probably because Commander uses all the cards in Magic, basically. There's a small ban list, but most of the cards are legal in the format. And so getting access to 5 colors is relatively trivial in the format. And this sort of has led to certain powerful 5-color commanders ending up with being able to play sort of all of the queens from all the different colors. And you end up in kind of this like 5-color soup type deck where you can just have access to all of the best cards from each color. The other sort of solution to the queen problem here is that you have kind of these hard limits on certain aspects of the game. Like in 60-card Constructed, you can only play 4 copies of a card. And then when we get to Highlander formats, you can only play 1 copy of a card. There's sort of a hard set limit that says this is what you're allowed to do in deck building, and if you were able to put as many copies of a card as you wanted into your deck, which was the case when the game was first released, there's nothing stopping you there from just filling your deck with the best queens of those, whatever the best card is, and just filling your deck with it, basically. Another one that's sort of not as impactful as it once was, but legendary creatures were another solution to the queen problem, right? Where in 60-card formats, you could only have one copy of a legend in play. Card limitations start to break down is if designers print too many sort of functional reprints, right? Because this solution to the queen problem hinges on the fact that you can only play so many copies of a card in your deck as long as it has the same name. But if you change the name, now you can play multiple copies of each of those. One example would be something like Llanowar Elves and Fyndhorn Elves. Like, these are technically 2 different cards. So even in a format like Commander, where you're only allowed to play 1 copy of each card, these cards have the same function, but they have different names. And so you can play 2 copies, effectively, of this effect. And we've seen this come up quite a bit recently with some of the Commander-centric YouTube channels talking about how this is a problem and is kind of eroding this particular resistance to playing certain effects, where they've functionally reprinted so many copies of an effect that you can just play that type of an effect quite consistently, and so you end up with a deck that is more consistent than it should be, but only for particular types of effects that they've made a lot of functional reprints for. The one that immediately comes to mind is like an Aristocrats effect, which is basically when something dies, you gain a life, your opponents lose a life. They've printed a lot of these, and so that archetype is pretty easy to construct a quite consistent deck when you use that. That's sort of centered around that effect. Outside of the game systems, one of them I've talked about before is booster packs, which is a sort of direct erosion of players' ability to acquire the cards themselves. So the idea would be that if there is a queen in the set, like there or in the game at all, if your ability to acquire that queen is limited or is difficult, then you won't be able to play all queens because you just won't be able to have access to all of them. Booster packs themselves, the way that they break down is that they break down with money. If you can buy a lot of cards, you have infinite money, then you can have access to all the queens and your opponents wouldn't be able to. So not only is this a limitation for acquisition of game pieces, it also creates kind of a weird incentive, right? Which is, look, there's kind of some synergy here between capitalism and TCGs. So if this is kind of the uncomfortable truth, right? Is that if you spend more money, you will have access to more powerful game pieces, which means you'll probably win more games. And in formats like CEDH, they are proxy friendly. So in order to alleviate this problem, players can just print the cards that they need for their decks. There isn't an enforcement of you have to have legitimate cards printed from Wizards of the Coast to play in most of those tournaments. If the format was to be taken over by Wizards of the Coast at some point, that would more than likely be a requirement, which would change the nature of the format substantially. Quick aside about proxies real quick is that this is actually the dilemma with proxies, that if you start printing whatever cards you want, you are removing this solution to the queen problem. So as long as you're aware of it and you're not just sort of printing the most powerful cards that you could possibly want and filling your deck with them and then destroying all your friends, proxying is, you can kind of alleviate this particular issue with proxies. And another way that this is handled too is through formats. So different formats are going to have sort of the most powerful game pieces in them, but if you change the format, change the card pool, then those pieces will change and you'll have different queens being the most powerful cards. So it doesn't necessarily like this stops the queen problem as much as it changes which queens are the most powerful and sort of gives new life into your game pieces. There are formats though that do have rules built into them that are systems of entropy, like limited formats like draft or sealed, where you must open the cards from a booster pack and then you're only going to be able to get the queens that you open or draft in those environments. And so you're not going to be able to play the most optimal deck, and that elongates the lifespan of a set substantially when it's played in that type of a format. So the last kind of uncomfortable system that prevents the queen problem is power creep. And this doesn't so much as prevent the problem as it does provide new queens for players to attempt to acquire, right? So if your players have kind of maxed out on the most powerful game pieces, you can create another layer of more powerful game pieces so that now they have new queens to strive to acquire. And this is probably just the laziest way to solve this, right? You just continually make more powerful cards and then your players would have to get the new queens. And obviously this has a whole host of problems, but the biggest way that this one breaks down is that your game has a power ceiling, right? This is based on the set points of the game. Set points would be something like life total, number of cards in deck, like whatever the game is using to measure how the game ends, is usually a set point. And what that means is you have to balance your cards based around those set points. And so you can only power creep the game so much before the sort of game itself starts to break down. That being said, I think part of the reason why Magic has sort of had new life, breathed into it, basically, with Commander becoming the most played format in the game, is that the set points of the game are substantially different with Commander, right? Players have 40 life instead of 20, and that gives Wizards a whole new power ceiling to power creep cards to. And the consequence is that the older formats that are 1v1 and have 20 life end up getting a whole host of cards that are like way too powerful for those formats and probably breaking through that power ceiling that sort of should be acceptable for dynamic gameplay, basically, like gameplay that feels meaningful. This basically just happened with the card Fantasticar, which is a card that is literally made for a Commander product, but ends up in Legacy and Vintage because these are supposed to be formats that play all of the cards from Magic's history. There's a part of me that wonders like why Wizards didn't just exclude Commander cards from the Legacy format, but like whatever. That's like a whole other conversation. Okay, let's get into the forbidden solution. This is the one that was removed from Magic at its inception, right? This mechanic came out with the game as a system of entropy, a way to solve the queen problem, and immediately had to be removed. There's, I think, 9 cards that mention this mechanic in the game in its entirety, and they were all banned, I think, within the first, the first set's release, effectively. And this is Ante. So the way that Ante works is that Magic was built with this mechanic in the game on its launch, where every time you would sit down to play a game of Magic, you would both shuffle up your decks, and then you would reveal the top card of your library, and each player would put that card into the ante zone. Not only would it be removed from the possible cards that you could play that game, the stakes were that if you won or if you lost the game, you would also lose the card that was put into the ante zone to your opponent. If your opponent won, you win the cards that were anteed. I think it's important that we give a little bit of grace to Richard Garfield at the time when he's thinking about this idea, because he had no concept of the fact that like trading card games would explode to the heights that they have, today. He said often in his interviews that his concept of a successful like Magic the Gathering player would be that they'd buy like 5 boosters or something. Like it was a very small amount of product compared to ultimately what people have purchased in the game. And so he didn't really think that these cards would have like an associated monetary value with them or a personal identity associated with them. That's all stuff that sort of like came after the game had released. And so if we take a step back and we look at Ante as just a system of entropy, it is pretty interesting. It creates not only stakes for when you're playing the game, but it's also a way to move cards out of players' hands, right, into the hands of other players, and then perhaps back again if those players are sort of in the same play group. It also creates some amount of tension with players playing their most powerful game pieces. So if you fill your deck with all of your most powerful cards, it's more likely that you're going to ante up one of them. Now, there's kind of some weird tension with the fact that, like, if your deck is full of really powerful cards, you're probably more likely to win the game, so maybe you're more likely to win your opponent's cards. But if you could come up with a solution that used relatively cheap cards that weren't considered all that powerful, but you could win a lot of games with them, you could win a lot of more powerful cards, right, to add to your collection. So I think there's some design space here still, right? Like if you could build a game where the game pieces just weren't as valuable and players may not have the same kind of attachment to them, having this idea that the game pieces can kind of change hands, I think is pretty interesting. Maybe it's also possible that if you're playing in some kind of a league or something, you could like remove cards from people's decks when they lose or something, and then that way they won't have access to those queens anymore. And that can kind of be something that evolves over the course of multiple games rather than actually removing them from the players' collections. But whatever, I'm just kind of spitballing here. So ultimately, Ante was obviously removed from the game because players absolutely hated it. Once players became sort of emotionally invested in the game and attached to their cards, and the cards became worth substantial amounts of money in some cases, players obviously were not thrilled when they would have to ante up a card and then it would be potentially lost during the gameplay. It was often that players would basically ask for games with no ante, and so it became pretty obvious that the mechanic needed to go pretty early. The other problem is that as the game pieces gained substantial amounts of value, this basically became gambling, right? Like literally it could have potentially qualified as gambling legally, and that would have put Magic the Gathering in like a really weird spot. So that's all the different ways that Magic has sort of tried to solve the queen problem. So I think it's important that we understand that in order for your game to have customizable game pieces and remain playable long term, you have to come up with systems that will make it so that players can't just solve the game. And if we come back to those sort of game requirements, right, the meaningful decisions with uncertain outcomes and measurable results, maintaining that loop for as long as possible is the key to keeping a game unsolved and therefore replayable long term. Obviously, Ante is the big sort of failure here, but I do think that there's still some interesting things to learn. There's other ways that you could solve all of these problems, and I think that is one of the most interesting things about to design games that are living games that can change over time and that more components can be added. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think that it's possible we could ever create a system where anti could work? I think it's a particularly interesting thing to think about. And also let me know if you have any examples of how other games have solved the queen problem. But yeah, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.